From the European Parliament here in Brussels, this is Raw Politics. Thanks for joining us tonight, and this is what we have for you on the menu. Very vulnerable, the words of a former NATO chief on European elections and interference. Our exclusive interview. Fake news as Swedes go to the polls. A study says a third of online stories were bogus. Mole hunt, who's the White House insider behind that damning Trump op-ed? And in tonight's Power Play, Russia trolls Theresa May. Thank you for joining us here on Raw Politics. It's time to meet the panel. We have, of course, Darren McCaffrey, our political editor here at Euronews. Darren, which of these stories do you like best?
We're looking at this kind of sense of vulnerability, just kind of how vulnerable are we? I'm not entirely convinced that actually the influence that apparently is happening to elections is happening. Is it a bit of a vogue? I'm not entirely sure, so we'll be looking into that, I think.
All right, and also joining us tonight is Jennifer Baker. She's a journalist here in Brussels covering tech policy and politics. Which one do you like most?
Fake news, because it gives me the opportunity to, have a go at the big social media companies and the Googles and so on of this world, which is, what I live for.
Very exciting indeed. And joining us, Czech Republic MEP Jan Zahradil. He's also the president of the group of reformists and conservatives. Which of these stories do you like?
The mole hunt, because I think that the more negative stories come out about Donald Trump and the more ex-co-workers or that mysterious person now from within the White House are publishing negative stories about him, it seems that it's rather helpful to him than damaging.
I really wonder who that is. And we'll talk about all of these stories, of course. But first, our top story, days away from a vote in Sweden, months before EU elections, and the former head of NATO is raising the alarm over interference and influence. In an exclusive interview with Raw Politics, Anders Fogh Rasmussen says Europe is, quote, very vulnerable. Now, the comments come as party leaders in Sweden make their last major push ahead of a Sunday vote, the results of which will be closely watched in Sweden and around the world, of course. Well, the far right are expected to make historic gains in a campaign reportedly rife with Russian trolls, fake news and interference. And, of course, we're going to go deeper into the Sweden election with Anders Fogh Rasmussen in a bit. But first, our exclusive interview. We talked about bots, deepfakes and election interference. Let's take a look. Be it Russia or another country, is this a new line of defense in geopolitics?
Yes, it is. Actually, this is a new frontier, I would say. And the technology to be used will be more and more advanced. So we have to develop technologies to protect ourselves better, for instance, to identify the so-called bots, deep fake news, where they can pretend that a specific politician has stated this or that, but it's deep fake news because it's not that person.
All right, I want to play this video for you. You mentioned it earlier.
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit.
I think we'll
Yeah. It's an example. It is not Obama, but people think this is Obama.
So my question to you is the technology so close? How far is the technology from the point where we can no longer tell whether this is real or not?
It's round the corner. So it may well be that it's out there already. You never know.
So the European Commission, they will be releasing the package next week on how to prevent meddling in the elections. Do you think it's enough what the European Union is doing?
Well, we don't know all the details, but let me put it this way. I don't think we can do enough, but I think the Commission and the European Union is on the right track, and we are willing in our Transatlantic Commission to assist the EU all we can.
How vulnerable is the European elections to meddling or interference?
I think they're very vulnerable. In certain countries, you have a very, very low turnout in European elections. So it's very easy for Russia and also other countries to meddle in our elections.
Very vulnerable, Darren. This was a story that piqued your attention. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, clearly, with advancements in technology, there are cleverer and cleverer ways for governments and for other actors to try and influence how people vote. And, that Barack Obama video, even though it's pretty rudimentary still, you can envisage in the future that will get really good. However, I do think, yes, there is an element of vulnerability. Of course there is. And there always has been. Have state actors and non-state actors try to influence elections? Yes, they have, and they've always tried to do that. But I think you do also undermine the sophistication of the electorate as well, of voters. They're not idiots. People are not idiots. And I think there is an element in which actually, people like this and other politicians just won't trust that the electorate is a pretty sophisticated body.
Indeed. I want to bring up the technology part of it because it's a big part of what Rasmussen was talking about. And Jennifer, this is something you've been looking at. What do you think? Where are we in that regard?
I mean, the question is not whether you can produce something that is convincing. You can, okay, that Obama one wasn't a great example,
sure,
but you certainly can produce these things that are convincing. It's the time, the effort and the sort of motivation that goes into producing those. I mean, a small-time actor is not going to have the resources to produce something that's really legitimately convincing. And as you say, it's about convincing voters. I mean, in a sense, this is a cultural problem and it needs a cultural solution rather than trying to sort of brute force it with tech filters or something. I mean, your big social media companies already have filters in place, but they're quite unsophisticated and they will end up cutting out a lot of legitimate content as well as fake content.
It's going to get better and better, the technology, isn't it?
Well, you would hope so, but I mean, if we compare it to, say, copyright, where they have the filters, exactly the same sort of thing applies, or hate news, hate speech, where they also have filters. So much of the stuff, you get an awful lot of false positives. And this is where maybe education is better than just trying to sort of wipe it out in some sort of blanket fashion.
And Jan, you're an MEP. Are you worried about this in light of the upcoming elections?
By the way, I didn't believe it was Obama from the very first second.
You can't be fooled.
I would be worried if you hadn't done that. I would have been genuinely worried.
Look, I'm 55 years old and I've been living first 26 years of my life in a communist state. So I was quite used to various types of propaganda, the Russian propaganda, Soviet propaganda. And I believe that particularly we from Central and Eastern Europe are quite sensitive to some forms of double talk or double think. We are maybe better able to uncover those things. So yes, I believe that those things are happening. Yes, I believe that we should not underestimate them. Yes, I absolutely believe that there are new technologies and new ways how to do that. But on the other hand, I would 100% subscribe what you have said, that people are not idiots and we should not underestimate people as well. There is definitely a certain common sense of electorate and I still believe and I trust into that.
Yeah, well, people are not idiots indeed. But when we're talking about the internet, where you find a lot of information, there tends to be the echo chamber where people who believe one thing tend to gravitate towards that one idea.
No, I mean, that is true. But again, that is not. That has always happened. I think we lose sense of the fact that actually, people have always, like 100 years ago, the same people grew up in the same village, they associated themselves with the same types of people, and yet they're now doing it online. Is that healthy? No, it probably isn't. But the big question also about this vulnerability is who tackles it? So state actors. But are those state actors acting necessarily in the best interest? Could that protection be misused? Could it be used to censor? I mean, these are whole loads of questions. And I think, yes, we're vulnerable, but just how much influence are these bots, all these state actors genuinely having in how
But the EU is going to be bringing out some measures, right? Do you think that's going to be effective?
I mean, things have changed. You say we've all been in a bubble in villages 100 years ago, but what's massively changed is the volume and the velocity and the vectors of this information that you're getting that simply didn't exist in a village of 200 people who it took 3 days to get the news from London from. That is a very, very different proposition than a normal old-fashioned filter bubble, even with, modern media and newspapers.
It is, but the dissemination of the news that reached those people 100 years ago was in many ways as misinformed or could be misquoted as it is today.
We'll leave this part of the conversation because, Rasmussen was talking about the European elections, but there's one election that's coming up in the weekend. And we also talked about the Swedish elections. His organization, they're following this very closely. And let's listen to what he had to say. The Sweden elections. Your organization has been looking and following this very closely. We saw reports about Russian bots meddling or interfering. Are the reports? What did you find in this, in following this?
Well, we found that the bots serve the purpose to accumulate news about specific issues. For instance, we know that in Sweden, immigration is a hot issue, and it is an issue that creates divisions in the Swedish society. So the bots can generate news that are partly fake news.
But the issues are real, huh? We're not saying that the issues are not real. We're not saying this is about bots. It's about their issues are real as well.
Exactly.
Sure.
We do have some real issues here, and I think to prevent such undermining from the Russian side or creation of division, politicians in Sweden should address the main issues, which of course is a much too liberal immigration policy for years. It's a political correctness in the Swedish society that has created the basis for the Russian intervention.
I think what he was talking about here is slightly more subtle. You know, taking an issue that is a real issue and then just using confusion and chaos. I'd like to get your perspective on this.
Well, again, I'm afraid about one thing when it comes to next year's European elections, and this is that some future potential losers of those elections might try to find some excuse by blaming some external influence like, you know, Russian meddling or fake news or whatever. Again, I'm not underestimating that. That's going on. By the way, Russian propaganda has been going on for decades, and even during the Cold War and during the existence of the Iron Curtain, they have been trying to influence electoral results in various countries. So, I do not underestimate that. But on the other hand, we should be able to identify real problems that are causing change of the political situation in some particular countries, not just to blame fake news or some external propaganda.
But that's why this seems to be more sinister, so to speak. What about Sweden in particular? Because this is very leftist. Now we see a surge to the right.
Well, if we compare it to, say, the US presidential election, which, we all heard about the Cambridge Analytica scandal, one of the areas where these sorts of bots disseminating news, where it was most effective, was in preventing people getting out and voting. So it was this kind of discouraging of actual taking part in the democratic process, which is in itself a big problem when you consider that the European elections are very often not even taken seriously as a democratic vote for who you want to represent you in Europe, and are often just used as we don't like the incumbent government, as a kind of a protest vote at home. So I think that is one area where any sort of manipulation, interference could just disrupt the whole idea of a European election as a democratic process.
So what can Europe do? I mean, you mentioned censorship a bit earlier, that there is a line, that if you fight that with technology as well, are you going to start censoring? Are you going to start stopping?
Yeah, and this is where it's incredibly difficult, and clearly you do not want external forces who are there to undermine the electoral process to have influence. That must be said, though, of course, this is a two-way process. For example, Britain helps fund pro-democracy movements in Russia, now, who clearly do not like Vladimir Putin. Is that Britain influencing Russian elections? Well, yeah, I'm sorry, it is. You don't see a massive outcry in the British or European media about that. So it is a two-way process, we have to understand. However way it happens, who's involved, it's not good. The question is, and the question for all these policymakers is, how do you stop it? Particularly with technology, it is incredibly difficult as that technology becomes more and more sophisticated.
Right, we were talking about serious topics with Rasmussen there, but we did do something fun. Here is our little game that we played after that interview. I would like to play a little game with you, word game. I'll mention a few names, 5 names, and you just tell me the first thing that comes to mind, like an adjective, okay?
I'll try.
Okay. Vladimir Putin.
Dictator.
Okay. Donald Trump.
Fake news.
Emmanuel Macron.
European visions.
Angela Merkel.
Strong leader.
Jean-Claude Juncker.
Well, he is the outgoing Commission President.
Russia.
Russia. Divisive.
The state of democracy.
Challenged.
EU sovereignty.
Should be stronger.
All right. Anders Fogh Rasmussen, thank you very much for joining us on Raw Politics.
You're welcome.
All right, which one was your favorite there?
He really struggled with Russia.
I know he did.
Well, I mean, as a result, he's talking about the entire country, but...
They're also diplomatic. I don't think he was speaking truly from the heart. He was speaking from the head there.
Yeah, and what about you, Jan?
Well, the question of sovereignty, it's interesting how many people are shy these days to say something very concrete about that.
Indeed.
And also how everyone accepts that democracy is under threat. Well,
Sure.
I mean, we've had this all week.
Sure.
And every single person has given the same response, that it is being challenged.
Hasn't it always been?
Maybe it should always be.
Maybe it'll bounce back stronger.
You would get the same response in almost every historical period since democracy has been existing. It's still here.
As Theresa May would say, nothing has changed.
All right, thank you, guys. Let's leave that conversation for now because we have a lot more coming up on Raw Politics. Donald Trump's loyalty problem. After White House mole pens a scathing op-ed, we talk about trust and responsibility and who's really calling the shots in politics. Plus, will Swedes turn to the right this weekend and what that vote means for Europe? Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, this Sunday, the Swedes are expected to vote in a highly anticipated and divisive vote. Now, the far-right Swedish Democrats, they have seen a surge in popularity in this campaign, and some are even saying that they could hold the balance of power. Now, also, a new study is suggesting that this campaign has been inundated with fake news, and this is something our team in Lyon, The Cube, has been looking into. Alex, what have you found with regard to fake news in this Swedish campaign?
Well, a bit of a test for you, Tessa and panel. I'm sure you're familiar with the term fake news. How about junk news? And I'll show you why. That's the term that's come out of this study from Oxford University, looking at the build-up to the Swedish election. And junk news is a term that fills the whole report. So what exactly is it? Let me break it down for you, taking you through this report. Well, first of all, they're saying that 1 in every 3 articles shared online on social media in the run-up to this election is what they call junk news. Now, what exactly is junk news? Well, they define it as saying junk news is a source that shares deliberately misleading and inaccurate information, and particularly that has a right-wing slant on issues like Islam, integration, and social issues. They're using that term junk news. Fake news comes under that category. Now, this analysis went over a 10-day period in August, and the researchers here looking at 275,000 tweets. Now, they identified 3 main sources of junk news using their terms, which accounted for 85% of that content. That's these 3 sites here. All 3 of them are right-leaning. They are right-wing sites. And the researchers saying that 85%, as I say, of that fake junk news shared by these sources. And they say, therefore, that for every 2 articles from genuine news media read, 1 is misleading, deliberately misleading its readers. And actually, Sweden seems to have a particular problem with this. Let's just pull up a quote from the research authors here. One of them here, Professor Phil Howard, you can see, saying that compared with other elections in Europe, looking at France and Germany, Swedish users are sharing by far and away the most junk news of all. In fact, saying that Sweden, second to America, has the biggest problem with this. So the one question, Tessa and team, that this leaves hanging in the air is if and to what extent any of this junk news will affect that poll on the weekend.
Thank you for that, Alex and the Cube team. And here in Raw Politics, all week we've been showing you stories from Sweden ahead of the elections. Now, tonight we will show you the story of 2 men who are at the opposing ends of the immigration debate. Here's a report from Euronews' Stefan de Vries.
Here in Gothenburg, the 8 competing parties are actually campaigning together. It's very joyful, people are talking together, you don't really see any political differences. It more or less feels like a Christmas market, and I think this is campaigning the Swedish way.
It all looks peaceful, but this year it's different. The Sweden Democrats, with roots in the neo-Nazi movement, is stirring up Swedish politics. According to their leader, the country needs to be saved.
Mitt namn är Jimmy Åkesson och jag kommer göra allt för att reda ut det kaos som ni socialdemokrater och ni moderater har skapat.
Åkesson is 39 years old, but an even younger generation is already knocking on the doors of parliament. Tobias Andersson is the president of the youth wing of the Sweden Democrats. At 22 years old, he is almost certain to become one of the youngest Swedish MPs.
Why did you choose to go into politics?
It happened by mistake. I saw certain issues in the country when it came to segregation, to criminal rates and so on, that I really felt that I could help and that I could do something about that.
I see actually a very happy country, very rich country. What do you think are the problems this society is facing now today?
Well, it's segregation and when it comes to criminal acts. I mean, we have an issue right now with high amounts of sexual assaults and rapes and so on, and that's obviously safety is the biggest issue this country is facing, and to a far extent that has been going on as a consequence because of the migration policies that we've had.
There's actually no proof that immigration and crime in Sweden are linked, and although there is a light increase in crime in general, compared to other European countries, Sweden is still relatively safe.
I don't want to compare Sweden to other countries. I want Sweden to be safe, and I want people to feel safe in Sweden. And then it doesn't matter for me how the criminal rates are looking in other European countries.
The Sweden Democrats could become the kingmakers of a new government after the elections, but the party prefers not to govern.
I'm quite sure that the other parties will do their best to put us out of government and make sure that we are not a part of it. But we've been the only opposition for 4 years, and that has really been good for our as a party.
Tobias, we can just see the roof of the parliament. That's probably where you will be working in a couple of weeks from now, right?
That's true.
What are you going to do on the first day as a Swedish MP?
Well, I'm gonna take a sleeping the day after. So.
Over the past 5 years, Sweden took in almost 700,000 refugees and migrants. This may worry Tobias Andersson and the Swedish Democrats, but many newcomers integrate successfully. One of them is Hussam Al-Homsi. Just 3 years ago, he arrived in Sweden as a war refugee from Syria. He now speaks Swedish fluently and is a consultant at Deloitte in Stockholm.
We are in Sweden, and in Sweden people speak Swedish, and everybody obviously want to speak their own language, which is something I respect, of course. I started speaking with people in Swedish, of course making a lot of mistakes. A lot of the time was funny. I would say something sometimes embarrassing, but people would know that I'm just trying to speak. The attitude that people has against immigration, the stress that people has when they start talking about immigration and immigrants and integration. Obviously, these are very hot topics, but I respect that people are scared. People see problems and they want to fix it.
Do you see a future for yourself here in Sweden?
Of course, I like it, and I would love to stay. We're getting into the election right now, and who knows what's going to happen. I have very good friends and network, and I have normal life here, nice life here. So I'd like to continue and stay.
Hussam and Tobias might be each other's ideological opposites, but they also have a lot in common. They are two ambitious, well-spoken young men who are passionate about Sweden and concerned about its future. In another political climate, they might have been friends. This Sunday, Swedish voters will decide which path the prosperous Nordic nation will take.
Well, with me to unpick the politics and see what's swaying Swedish voters is our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, Teresa Kushler, a Swedish journalist from Svenska Dagbladet, and Politico's Ryan Heath. Teresa, I'll start with you. You're from Sweden. What did you think? You were reacting to that report. Tell us what you think about integration, immigration, all the issues.
In general, I just want to say that foreign media in general, they're focusing a lot on the Sweden Democrats and the rise of the far right and the integration. But obviously for us Swedes, we don't really recognise ourselves in this. It's an election with many, many topics. We talk about taxes, unemployment, the welfare system, the school system, whatever. So it's I think it's a little bit strange to see all these apocalyptic reports from around the globe about how basically integration is the lack of integration is destroying Sweden.
But isn't it true that the Swedish Democrats could become one one of the largest
They could become one of the
parties.
largest, but to be honest, they already entered Parliament. They got 14% in the last election. So that was actually 5 years ago was the big surprise when they got more than 40 seats in the Parliament. I mean, you can compare to, for instance, UKIP in the UK, who's never had any elected seats in Westminster, or Marine Le Pen in France, who never had 40 seats in any assembly. So that was a lot. So the big, bang, bang surprise, that was 5 years ago. And now we've gotten used to the idea that they might grow and they might grow.
And Ryan, I'll put it to you. You're part of the foreign media outside watching Sweden. I mean, could the Swedish Democrats be a kingmaker, have the balance of power?
They could. I mean, what Swedes are used to is a government being formed within 24, 48 hours after the election. We might not see that this time. Sure. However, the Swedish Democrats were up to 24% in the polls in July. They're now down to 19. They're the party that's been losing over the summer.
Right.
So that's obviously better than they were doing, but they're not at risk really of coming first in the polls anymore. So I think we do need to keep it in a little bit of perspective there.
All right, what do you think, Gary?
Well, I was going to ask actually how you feel about the perception that's now being built up about Sweden. Because you're right, there is this now perception that actually this kind of bastion of kind of social liberalism is no longer the case. I mean, Donald Trump routinely quotes Sweden in his speeches.
Absolutely.
Well, it's actually interesting for me to see that the word Sweden is now not just a country, it's a concept. If you see the alt-right voters or whatever, they will say, Sweden. And they don't need to explain anymore. Everybody knows what they mean. Just like, if we here in Brussels, we say Macron, everybody knows what we mean. We mean liberal,
but is there an element of truth
like
that Sweden is facing problems that it has not seen before?
To be honest, crime is down, but perception of crime is high. We have the typical, also what your reports here before showed, that there's a lot of news coming out.
But perception does drive opinion and does drive people to vote.
It's true. Well, here is an important point, though. Sweden, in contrast to its feminist perception, has always had very high, surprisingly high levels of domestic violence. So the idea that somehow refugees have brought that to Sweden in the last 3 years is really a false idea. It's one of the dirty secrets of Sweden. So there's a lot of perception at play, but it's not always one-way traffic.
And the one thing, for instance, I know that Nigel Farage from UKIP front figure, he has often mentioned the high rape numbers of Sweden. But there's a very simple explanation for that. There is no pan-European definition of rape. And we changed our law in Sweden to put all kinds of actions to be defined as rape that was previously defined as sexual assault. So we have incredible number of rapes, obviously because
Julian Assange being the famous case study.
I mean, it isn't not even defined as a rape in other European countries.
But as it is in every country, there are the nuances, clearly. But even here in Brussels, when MEPs from other countries look at what's happening in Sweden, they are looking at it with a bit of anxiety because it could impact what will happen here in Brussels. So there is, yes, it's a perception, but there is a fear of an actual impact.
Yeah, and we've been saying this week that that Sweden is becoming a bit like the rest of Europe? That is becoming a typical European country.
There is also, sometimes they say, it used to be a happy welfare state, but now it's a country run with problems. I'm sorry, the welfare state is still there. We still have free school and free healthcare, and we still have, up to 2 years of parental leave. Like the welfare state is not in opposition to immigration or integration. Yes, there have been, of course, problems with integration because we have received many, many immigrants, and not just now in the last few years, but for half a century. And, it has created this pocket. But to be honest, if you also look at statistics over European countries and how welcoming they are to immigrants, Sweden is still top of that list, with something close to 80% saying immigration is good.
Well, certainly we will all be watching closely this Sunday. Yeah. Let's leave it at that for now. It's time for Power Play of the evening. It comes to us courtesy of Russia. Its weapon of choice, humor. Let's take a look. We can all remember the pictures from last week when Britain's Theresa May traded diplomacy for the dance floor on a tour of Africa. Well, as the UK and Russia prepare to face off at the United Nations over the Novichok nerve agent attack, Russia has found a novel way to brush off the international scandal. The Russian ministry tweeted this video, May's now famous dance set to traditional Russian music, an innocent trolling of the UK leader, or a not-so-subtle power play. What do you think, Ryan? Trolling?
Oh, that's definitely trolling. The Russian social media accounts are A-list trollers. So I don't think that's really the right approach to a poisoning situation, but it is very...
It is also very good trolling, though. I mean...
It is. I couldn't help smiling, and I knew I shouldn't.
No, I know.
No,
in saying that, you just smile every time you see that video of Theresa May.
Yeah.
So.
All right, thank you, guys. We will have a lot more coming up on the program on Raw Politics. The whodunit over Donald Trump and White House secrets, and what it all says about loyalty and who's really making the decisions in politics. Welcome back to Raw Politics. Now, in case you're wondering who is going to star in the next Bond film, well, we have the inside scoop. From the looks of tonight, it's Donald Tusk. Well, pretty strong contender there for James Bond. Now, this is a video that was tweeted by Donald Tusk himself. It seems like he's trying to get people excited about what's coming up here in Brussels, all those summits and everything else that's happening. What do you think, Ryan?
I am so glad you asked me about this. This is a merging of two old playbooks. So that music, the boom, boom that was going on there, that is straight out of a video that I helped make with YouTube in 2011 for then President José Manuel Barroso's State of the Union speech. And this is Donald Tusk maneuvering to take the limelight from Jean-Claude Juncker when he delivers the State of the Union speech next week. You will notice...
It's a power play.
Exactly. That the State of the Union speech was not mentioned anywhere in there, and this was gazumping him. That's exactly what was going on there.
Oh, that is so interesting. What do you think about that, Teresa?
Oh, just on the film itself, I think it was very funny.
Do you think people are going to get excited about it? I think that was the point, to get people...
maybe
more involved.
Yeah. Tusk is funny. He has a sense of humour, and I've been here for so long, and I've seen so many hopelessly boring ads and hopelessly boring. They don't even, people wouldn't remember it after, 10 minutes after it was sent.
That is a major problem in Brussels here. There are a lot of big issues, important issues that affect people's lives.
I mean, you can add a bit of drama to it. It was actually quite good.
I thought that was very funny. This one was very funny. That's what I meant.
I will work on. That's Celine Dion.
Yeah.
Like, he's ripping off everyone.
Come on, give the guy a break. It's not if Putin had done it, we would have, it was almost kind of Putin-esque.
Yeah,
but I quite liked it. But you're right. We get so many dull documents and briefings and stuff. If we can add any form of drama to it, I'm all for it.
He has quoted Game of Thrones a couple of times.
And Donald Tusk, he's been getting better at making quips that make headlines, I think, recently. All right, now Donald Trump. Now he's on the defensive after bombshell editorial in the New York Times. In the article entitled "I am part of the resistance," the anonymous author claims to be a senior Trump official. He or she says the president's own staff are working to frustrate his agenda to preserve democratic institutions, and adds that Americans should know that there are adults in the room who are trying to do what's right. Now, Trump denies the claims and calls the author gutless. All right. What do you think? What do you guys think about that?
Who is it? Who is it? No one knows, obviously. I've heard everything today from Mike Pence to Sarah Sanders to possibly one of Trump's family. But no one quite knows. I think what is interesting are two things. First of all, it clearly isn't, but could it be Trump himself? Because his main argument is that there is this deep state that is working against him, and this surely is evidence for that. And I think that does raise another question, actually. And this is not just the case. Many would say this is exactly the same in the UK with Brexit, that there is this deep state, there is the civil service, essentially, who are working against what the democratic what the democracy of that country was. And I think that is a slight concern. At the end of the day, Donald Trump is president of the United States. One of the reasons he's president is because people want things to change. Whether you like it or not, people want things to change. They want the swamp to be drained. And this is evidence that is being impeded. And that's not good in a democracy, I don't think. Irrespective of what you think of Donald Trump.
Can he survive this?
No, I don't think it's about Trump even. The whole point of the American democracy is that it's dispersed power. It's not a monarchy. It is not authoritarian or monarchical reign, which seems to be what Donald Trump is aiming at. So I don't think that there are other people who don't agree with him in the system. I don't think that means democracy is being subverted.
But the founding fathers were talking about the Senate, about Congress, about the Supreme Court. They weren't necessarily talking about White House or administration officials impeding democracy.
Nor were they talking about people randomly ordering assassinations.
I'm going to get, Teresa, get you involved here. So who do you think is in control? Do you think the bureaucrats are in control or Trump is in control?
This is, to be honest, I really haven't given it too much thought. What I have been thinking about is what do politicians and negotiators and diplomats on this side of the Atlantic make out of this? Is it like, whew, you know, oof, at least we don't have to deal with him. At least, you know, there's a functioning administration behind him. Or is it, oh dear, they're going to start stabbing each other in the back now. We're going to have to just leave them alone.
What about here in Europe? You've been covering the EU quite a while. Is this who controls this place?
I think that it's also a dispersed power system. That's what makes it slow and cumbersome. That's what annoys people about it. It takes a long time to come to any decision. However, I've never seen this level of backstabbing inside any European administration. Martin Selmayr, the man who runs the European Commission,
about that recently.
He would not tolerate this level of backstabbing and snakery inside the headquarters of Brussels.
And you must think, where is Donald Trump's head? I mean, my words. I mean, that is the question in itself. But having to deal with all of this, which ultimately he obviously just brands as fake news, but, you know, the investigations, the policy issues, the backstabbing. I mean, God, I really hope someone is taking contemporaneous notes of all of this.
I think people might be taking notes as well.
I really hope so. It'll be the best
we have
drama.
a popular guy who, you know, he's popular with the voters. He doesn't say much of but I think interest. There's behind him. This is a recipe for us here in Europe. Let's have a government where we run business on the side, and on front we put a really colourful person.
But you know, here, I mean, we see it here, even in the European Parliament. So let's talk about the concept of loyalty versus responsibility. You know, people working for an individual. What do you think is a balance between those two?
I think that people do act in a very loyal way. In my efforts to report something like the Me Too...
Regardless of whether it's right or not.
Yeah, so thinking about the Me Too scandal, there's a lot of people who would anonymously report stories that I personally believe, but out of loyalty to their individual boss or their party, they would refuse to go on the record. And it was an enormously frustrating experience to try and highlight what was clearly a real problem, but do it to very ethical reporting standards.
Can I use the adjective dangerous? I mean, it's a dangerous behavior.
I thought it was blind loyalty.
Right.
And I would say that. My interest in a journalist is to get this story out, and I wasn't able to a lot of that time because of the loyalty that people showed. I would have thought they could be more responsible to a wider value system.
All right. It could be the end of a political career. We'd say, OK, so you made your point, now go home, pack your bags, and you'll never have work for this party again. Imagine you spent your whole youth years, you know, in the youth group of the party.
But we obviously what the essence of the officials or the civil servants are there to do. They are there to essentially carry out the work of the democratic elected person, not to either impede or distort what they think that version should be. And if that is happening, I think that is a challenge to democracy.
If it's in the White House directly, the Justice Department is not there to carry out Donald Trump's will.
Does anyone feel sorry for
Trump
and the loyalty? Does anyone here feel?
I don't think.
All right. Let's leave it at that. Let's leave it at that. Now, today's raw moment, and it features a run-in between Alex Jones, the American internet conspiracy theorist, and U.S. Senator Marco Rubio.
Marco Rubio, the snake. Little frat boy here.
All right, man.
Yeah.
Who are you, man?
Yeah, sure.
This guy? I swear to God, I don't
you
know
better
who
hope
you
you
are,
can deplatforming. Tens of millions of views.
InfoWars.
Bigger than Rush Limbaugh. He knows who InfoWars is. Playing this joke over here. That's why the deplatforming didn't work.
But here's the question. Here's a question.
Hey, don't touch me again, man. I'm asking you not to touch me.
Well, sure, I'll just patted you nicely.
I know, but I don't want to be. I don't know.
You want me to get arrested?
I don't know who you are.
It's not just going to take my First Amendment.
Man. You're
it's not just enough to take my First Amendment.
Myself.
Oh, he'll beat me up.
I didn't say that.
I know I am, but he's so mad. You're not going to silence me. You're not going to silence America.
Well, but there are people.
You are literally like a little gangster thug.
There are people in this country.
Rubio just threatened to physically take care of me.
Yeah, awkward moment there. What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, it sums up just how angry and divisive America seems at the moment. And that one clip just encapsulates it. And it's, you know, it's not good for the United States of America. This is a country that is torn in so many different directions at the moment, and its politics is very, very toxic.
Yeah, Ryan, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. Yeah. I think that you have a culture of journalism that is trying to go all into those halls as well. So you open yourself up as a politician to that sort of frustrating situation. But Alex Jones isn't a real journalist, so I'm not sure what he is doing in those halls.
And quick word from you, Teresa?
Well, I remember that he stated that it was all just an act. That was the theatre persona that he presented. And I'm every time I see him, I'm trying to see where the act starts and the real person starts, and vice versa.
All right, well, thank you, everyone, for your thoughts today, and thank you for joining us here on Raw Politics. We'd like to hear your views, of course. Tell us what you're talking about. I'm on Twitter at Tessa Ercilia, or you could follow us on Twitter at Euronews and use the hashtag Raw Politics. Have a good evening, and bye for now.